Good evening and welcome. My name is Ginger Fay and I'm one of the directors at Appleruth Tutoring Services. We are a test prep and academic tutoring company, and we work with students all over the world and some right here in the US who are setting goals for themselves to improve their grades, improve their standardized test scores, and improve their organizational efforts so that they can be the success that they want to be in life and school and work and fun. We are delighted to be able to work with students, and we're so excited that you're here with us tonight. One of our ethics at Appleruth is to share good ideas and information, and we are very fortunate that we have a wonderful set of colleagues who are willing to do that with us. And tonight I'm joined by a favorite friend and colleague, Chanel Thomas, who's Associate Director of Financial Aid and Scholarships at Vanderbilt University. Chanel is a Commodore through and through, 2 degrees from Vanderbilt, if I'm remembering right, and has worn a lot of different hats for the university over the years, and is just an absolute domain expert when it comes to need-based financial aid and why everyone should start their college affordability search thinking about the need-based financial aid process. So I'm thrilled that Chanel would be with us any evening, but I'm especially grateful tonight because she has not been feeling well, and she is rallying for us tonight and is ready and eager to answer your questions and share some fantastic information. So if questions occur to you as we are talking, Chanel and I are going to go through this presentation together. And if there are questions you have, things that come up, special circumstances you want to make sure that we address, please feel free to put them in the question and answer box, and we will try and cram as many of those details and specifics as we can into the next hour. If you are not able to take notes while you are doing all the other things that we do in an evening, homework, dinner, juggling it all, know that we will be sharing the slide deck with you. Chanel's been generous enough to share that with us, and a recording of this conversation as well. So feel free to take notes now, or just listen and learn and know that you'll have a chance to review them later. So thank you all so much for being here. I am excited for us to have this conversation. I've also worked in college admissions and college counseling for many years. I worked at a rival school. I worked at Duke University, my alma mater, double time. So I'm happy to share a little bit of perspective from the admission side of things, as well as working on the student side of things as a school counselor and helping students, some of whom were the first in their family to go to college, fill out all those forms and sort of make sense of the hieroglyphics that it seems like you're attacking. So I'm grateful for you all being with us this evening, for engaging with us in conversation. So keep those questions coming into the Q&A box as they occur to you, and Chanel and I will get started. Chanel, do you want to go to the next slide? There we go. Okay, so here's what we're going to talk about tonight. We're going to talk a little bit about what financial aid is all about. What does it mean? What does that term mean? Chanel is going to talk to you a little bit about needs analysis, how an office like hers goes through a financial aid application and determines what a family's financial need is. All of us could determine our financial wants, but the federal and institutional methodology determines our needs. She's got some terrific resources to share in terms of financial aid checklists and what a financial aid package looks like, so you know what to expect. And I think the star of the show is talking about special circumstances, because if it were easy, we wouldn't be here having this conversation. So we're going to talk a little bit about some of the special circumstances that impact families and students as they go through this process. So first up, we're going to talk about what is financial aid. So very simply put, financial aid is money given or loaned to a student and or their family to help pay for their university education. It typically has 2 components. One is grant aid. That's a present that you don't have to pay back. That goes by a lot of different names in the forms that you get. Some schools call it a grant. There are some federal grants like the Pell Grant. Some schools call it a scholarship, but it is really just a gift that does not have to be repaid. There's also a portion of a need-based financial aid package that is what we call self-help, which means that you're putting in a little sweat equity to get the money. It's not just a gift. And so that would include loans, which could be low interest federally subsidized loans, which are really a helpful and affordable way to create the liquidity to be able to finance college and pay for it over time. And federal loans have limits, so that the idea is to keep students at a level of debt that is manageable. Nobody wants students to wind up saddled with debt when they graduate from college and unable to make the choices that they want to continue their education in graduate school or to pursue the profession that they want, which may or may not be particularly lucrative for, say, those of us who went into education, for example. And then Work Study is a federal program that invites students to get a job while they're on campus. Once again, when you do a job on campus, you get some benefits that you don't necessarily have if you're doing a job off campus. So your boss is someone who also works for the university and has a vested interest in you pursuing your education and graduating on time when you work at a work study job. That cannot always be said for the cafe on the corner or anybody else in town. Their interest is their business and its success. So work study job typically limits students to the hours that they can work, starts out kind of low their first year, and then they can have increasing responsibilities. A work study job on campus can often be a resume building opportunity for students. They could maybe, give tours for the university. They could, if they were pre-admissions officers like me, if they were interested in the sciences, they could have a lab job. You could also work in the library, which I don't know if anyone goes to the library and checks out books anymore, so that's a good way to do your homework on the side. So work study jobs can be a great way for students to afford college and also create spending money for them, so that they're not not beginning behind, I guess, while they're in school. Is there anything you wanted to add on that, Chanel, or am I doing okay?
Doing great.
Awesome. All right, so let's talk a little bit about the types of financial aid that are out there. People use the term scholarship kind of fast and loose, I find, out there in the world. On the university side of things, we try to be pretty specific, so it's clear which thing we're talking about at which time. So tonight we are really going to focus on need-based financial aid. So that's the amount, that's the award that is given based on a review of federal and nationally recognized forms. We're going to talk about those forms in detail. I'm going to preview their things like Fafsa and the Css Profile, but we're going to talk about those in detail in a little bit. That is money that a need-based financial aid package comes based on your need, but is not necessarily related to how amazing you are as a human being. You're all pretty amazing already. The merit-based scholarships are coming to you from a particular university or from a particular organization that's making that award, and they're doing that award based on a special talent that they recognize. So it might be based on your academic achievement. It might be based on engagement that you have with your local community. It could be a special talent that you have. Perhaps it's in music. Everybody needs an oboe. They tune the rest of the orchestra. Or it could be an athletic scholarship. I also worked at a school where we really liked, a tall guy to stand in the middle quite a bit. So it could be any of those talents that might be recognized through a merit-based scholarship. It could also be based on a specific academic interest that a student has that organization or institution wants to recognize. And then, as we were talking about a little bit before about on-campus employment, there is an expectation when the university is helping support your education that students put what we call sweat equity, right? That they put a little skin in the game, and that they are doing some work while they're on campus to help support themselves. That is not a requirement, but it is a high expectation, and that students would come in having earned something over the summer, typically that helps support their education as well. There are lots of ways to afford college. One of them is to have a lot of money in the bank. Another is to win the lottery. And we are here to talk about what happens if neither of those two things have happened quite as fully and completely as they might have yet. Anything else you'd want to add on those things?
No, you covered it.
Great.
Thank you. Mhm.
Fantastic. All right. So let's talk a little bit about sources of financial aid. So paying for college can come from a variety of different sources, and the cost of college can vary pretty dramatically. So let's talk a little bit about some of the different places we can turn to for financial aid. One certainly is the federal government. And so that, as I mentioned before, there's something called the FAFSA that stands for Free Application for Federal Student Aid. That is required by almost every college or university in the United States that you might be considering. Any school that receives federal funding, which means any school that has any grants for research that happens on their campus, will require that students complete the FAFSA. There are also schools that will require students to complete the FAFSA even if they're not applying for need-based financial aid and just want to be considered for merit scholarships. Georgia Tech, which is in Atlanta where I live, is one of those schools that requires students to complete the FAFSA even if they think they won't qualify, but in order to be considered for merit scholarships as well. In addition to the FAFSA, some institutions will also require their own particular application. They might have some specific questions that they want to ask you. It may be also that they're part of a consortium where they all participate together, and that's the profile that we'll talk about in a second. There are also applications that you may want or need to complete for loan programs that are either loans that go directly to the student or a parent plus loan where the parent is actually the co-signer on the loan. Those are federal programs. That's the sort of how you apply for federal programs. State programs are also awarded through the FAFSA. So if you live in a state where there is a state merit scholarship program, again, to use Georgia as an example, we have a program here called HOPE. South Carolina has the Palmetto Scholarship. They also award those by virtue of doing the FAFSA. And then there are also some additional forms that you have to complete or an application really through the program that's sponsored by the state government. For institutional aid, you have to use the FAFSA as we talked about before, and then many private schools use something called the College Scholarship Service Profile, the CSS Profile, which may or may not be required. And then again, as we mentioned before, some institutions have their own applications. And then if you're applying for outside scholarships, rather than scholarships from within a specific university, it really, what you have to complete really depends on the organization, which means they all have their own applications. There are some interesting startups out there that are trying to consolidate the application process for outside scholarships. There's one called Scholly that's an app that's pretty cool that was created by a former Coca-Cola scholar, which I've read for the Coke Scholar program. So I met him. He paid his way through college using scholarships and wanted to pay it forward. Going Merry and Scholarships 360 are a couple of others that I think do a good job of consolidating those searches. And many other private opportunities will also require the FAFSA or the profile. And if your employer, as a parent, if your employer has any scholarships that they award, sometimes those require FAFSA and profile. They could also just require a student to complete the PSAT. That sometimes is what they use as their qualifying application. Did I miss anything?
No, that was it. Great.
Okay, all right. Now I turn it over to Chanel to talk a little bit about need analysis and what they do, the mystery that it is that they do over in the financial aid office.
Yes, no, thank you, Ginger. And it's good to be here with you all this evening. So need analysis, what do we do? And so this is where we review a student's eligibility for need-based financial aid. So we talk about it as in the financial aid world, there's a lot of different terminology. And so you're going to hear need analysis. And I liked how Ginger said it earlier. This is not want analysis, it's need analysis. So it's a little bit different. And this is where we're looking at the family's income and assets to determine their eligibility for financial aid. And so let's dive into the principles that we have. And I will be reading from the slide, but I think it's very important to understand these 4 principles on which need analysis is based upon, and our beliefs when you're working with the financial aid office. So you kind of have that perspective when you have to talk to a financial aid counselor or ask questions. You kind of know where they are coming from and how we are looking at it from our side of the desk. So to the extent they are able, parents have primary responsibility to pay for their dependent children's education. Secondly, students also have a responsibility to contribute to their educational costs. And so that refers to, the work study, the work expectation that was included in there. We always talk about students having some skin in the game, and research has shown that students perform better in college and when they have a job and they have a schedule and have to contribute towards some of their educational expenses. And then also families should be evaluated in their present financial condition. And so we are looking at where you are in the last couple of years to get a better idea of how your family can, how the family can help contribute towards educational expenses. And then lastly, a family's ability to pay for educational costs must be evaluated in an equitable and consistent manner, recognizing that special circumstances can and do affect its ability to pay. So I think it's very important to hear and know these principles as you're going through this process, to have an understanding of how we're trying to make sure that we are looking at everyone in an equitable manner when we're making decisions. There will be policies put in place to make sure that we are doing this as well, but also coming to the perspective that parents and children are to contribute towards their educational expenses. So I think this is very important when you're thinking about need-based financial aid.
My turn. I'm going to talk a little bit about the difference between need aware and need blind admissions. This is a really important distinction, and it requires you to ask the question of every college you visit, you're researching, or you're applying to know which category they fall into so you can make smart decisions about how to complete your application. So a school that is need blind does not consider that a student is applying for financial aid or how much that award would be when they are making an admissions decision. Chanel and I have been very fortunate to be able to work at need blind institutions for our career. And it is a gift and a wonderful gift to be able to work for a school where it truly has no bearing on the admissions process. I was talking with a colleague earlier today who has worked at several need aware schools, and it's the first thing they look at when they're looking at an application, and it skews the rest of the application. And it was the last thing I ever knew about an applicant, because way back 100 years ago when I worked in college admissions, there was something called paper that we used, and we sent students decision letters in a service called the mail. And so we actually didn't know until we were putting in the folder the students admit letter, and then on the other side would be their financial aid award. And that was when we knew if they had one at all. It had absolutely no bearing in the admissions process. A need aware school can take into consideration that a student is applying for need-based financial aid, as well as what level of award they might be eligible for were they to be admitted. And so it's really important to know if you're applying, if you have a really significant financial need, whether or not the school you're applying to practice need blind or need aware admissions. And some schools who are need aware are more aware at different times in the process. So for example, there are a few schools that are not need aware until the waiting list process. And also the strongest candidates are considered without regard for need, but as the party gets a little more crowded, they start paying a little bit more attention to that.
No, thank you, Ginger. And I just want to add to that sometimes schools can be need blind for domestic students, and it may be need aware for international students. So that is something to also keep in mind as you're going through the process as well, applying for financial aid also. But this is a great question that you need to ask, talk to your financial aid officers about it, or the admissions office on this. So now that we're getting into terminology, we're going to go a little bit deeper into some more terminology. We like to use a lot of acronyms and things when you get into the world of financial aid. So I think it's very important to kind of understand what we are talking about. And so cost of attendance, you hear that a lot, and it's also referred to as COA. And the cost of attendance, I want you to think about this as your sticker price. You know, when you're going to go buy a car, you see that sticker price, but that may not be what you pay. So just keep that in mind. So when you see the cost of attendance, but this is the total amount that it should cost a student to go to school. And so we're expressing this particular figure in a yearly figure. And the cost of attendance covers tuition and fees, room and board, and allowances for books and supplies, transportation, and miscellaneous expenses. So just think about your budget, if your parents, what you have to pay or what you're having your budget for your students while they're at home. And so now we're making them a new budget while they're at school. And then includes all those things. We know they have to eat, we know they need personal expenses, they need toiletries, they need all of those things to live while they are on campus. The one thing I want to break down a little bit further within this, though, however, is that there's a difference between what's called direct cost and indirect cost. So direct costs are those charges that you will be billed by the school. So it will be owed to the university. And then indirect charges are those, or indirect costs are those that will not be, that you would not be billed by the institution. And I think that's very important because it gives you a different perspective when you're reviewing the cost of attendance. You see that big sticker price and you're just like, whoa. But then when you start breaking it down, you start seeing the things that it includes within it. So direct costs that you will be billed by the institution, that includes tuition and fees, room and board. So those are your direct costs. Now for indirect costs, those are things like your books and supplies, transportation. We know you have to go home during breaks. So usually schools may include maybe 2 round trips for you to go home for Christmas, come back from Christmas, and go home at the end of the year. You know, you got spring break. So we put transportation in there as well. And then the miscellaneous expenses are those like personal expenses that I talked about. So just want you to kind of break that down and think about the costs. When you see those prices as you're looking at different institutions, break it down to see, okay, what is the direct cost that's going to actually be billed and owed to the institution? And then next, the one you probably are more familiar with that we say a lot is expected family contribution, the EFC. So this is the amount that indicates how much of your family's financial resources should be available to help pay for school. And so the EFC is used in determining your eligibility for financial need. And so when you see that expected family contribution, when you do that Fafsa application, it will typically provide you with your family's expected family contribution on there. When you see it, it doesn't mean that you readily have those resources available, because when you report your income and assets, some of your assets may or may not be liquid or readily available. But it's just looking at what is your financial strength. And this is the most fair way that we see that we can measure a family's financial strength and compare it as we're doing our review. So that's a very important term that you will hear a lot as you're going through the financial aid process, is expected family contribution. And this all comes to help us determine what is called your financial need. And so this is like an equation that we use in the world of financial aid. It's the difference between the cost of attendance and the expected family contribution. And this amount is your total eligibility for aid. And so schools that both require the FAFSA and CSS profile use the EFC. And so there's an EFC that will come from that CSS profile, and we'll discuss that a little bit later as well. And there's an EFC that comes from the FAFSA application. And typically the FAFSA application, the EFC, if you have an institution using both, that EFC from the FAFSA helps us determine what you're eligible for as far as federal aid. So that's your Pell Grant, you have the SEOG grant, or either federal loans. But we use the EFC from the CSS profile to determine your eligibility for institutional funds. So those numbers could be different. And that is why you'll see us using both the FAFSA and CSS profile to kind of determine eligibility in those 2 different areas. And I like this slide because you can actually see the equation. We're doing a lot of math in our world, so how financial need is determined. So it's an equation, cost of attendance minus expected family contribution equals your financial need. And so again, if we go with that cost of attendance, those components that are listed there, tuition and fees, books and supplies, room and board and transportation, that comes up with that yearly figure. Remember, it's a yearly amount. And even though it's a yearly amount, let me just say you're not billed yearly, okay? So if I know someone may have a little bit of an anxiety attack there, it doesn't all come at once. It's usually split into semesters. But then that expected family contribution, what goes into that is the parent's contribution from income, parents' contribution from assets, and then also it looks at the student contribution from income and the student's contribution from assets. And one thing to keep in mind when I'm thinking about income, I'm talking about all sources of income. So this is taxable and non-taxable. So this may be wages from work, contributions to retirement, health savings account, child support received, any in-kind support that was received. When I'm referring to assets, I'm talking about any UGMA or UTMA accounts. Those are included, 529 plans. This could include equity in your home or businesses, other real estate or trust as well. So these are things to know as you take into consideration what we are looking at when we're determining that expected family contribution. And Ginger, can you see if we have any questions real quick before I start this slide?
Sorry, I was busy typing a couple of responses to questions, and I had muted myself so you wouldn't hear my little clickety clackities. So we do have a few questions, and I am trying to answer a few of them as they come in, but I know we've got a lot to cover tonight, and I appreciate the good questions that are coming in. We're gonna talk, I think, a little bit about some specific questions about divorced and remarried families. So I think we can hold that question off for a second. But I wonder if we could talk a little bit about international students and how their ability to pay can be evaluated if they can't complete FAFSA. And maybe if we could also talk just a little bit about special circumstances, both students and parents who might be DACA recipients. And I'd be happy to talk about either of those things if you'd like.
No, thank you. And thank you all while I try to recover a little bit there. So with international families, a lot of schools have their own separate application. So you will not have to complete the FAFSA. But schools that use a CSS profile, there is an international version that is available. And so families can complete the international CSS profile. It takes into consideration the income that they're receiving in their particular country, and it measures the financial strength in comparison to US dollars. And so that is another way that we evaluate. Sometimes families aren't able to complete the international profile, but they may be able to complete the paper form of that application, but it's going to vary from institution to institution. But if the school accepts the CSS profile, that will be your application. Now, in regards to DACA, then that may be a little bit different. It varies from institution to institution. Still complete the CSS profile application. Some schools may move the student through the international process, and that is where it could be need aware in that review process for admission and for financial aid purposes. But we're still able to collect that data using the CSS profile application. So if you're a DACA or international, that is typically the way that you will apply, unless the school has their own separate application. So if you're not able to do the FAFSA, it's fine. Typically, you just communicate that with the school, and they will tell you the other ways in which you may apply.
And I would just add specifically for a student who's a DACA recipient, who's not a DACA recipient, but their parents are, the student is eligible for need-based financial aid if they have US citizenship or permanent resident status. So they would just complete the application as they normally would, and then it will ask for family information, but the parent's status will not impact the student's eligibility.
Thank you on that. And I think I'm gonna go ahead and move through the presentation. That's okay. Okay. So thank you for that. So here's just another equation and an example, just so when we're talking about different schools, cost of attendance is going to vary. It's going to vary from school to school, and your financial need is going to vary from school to school. The one thing that will stay consistent and constant is your expected family contribution. And so that in the middle is showing your expected family contribution. So the cost of attendance, since it will vary, your need will vary. So it's showing, just because you go to a school that has a higher sticker price, doesn't mean that you're going to receive more or less aid in comparison to other schools. So if you have high, your need will look higher at a higher school, is what this this graphic is trying to show you. So a lot of times when you see a high sticker price, you're like, oh man, I can't afford it, or that's the school that's out of my reach. Where in reality, it may not be, because you'll get more money to meet your demonstrated financial need. So really this is saying don't count a school out because of its price, because the expected family contribution stays consistent and constant there, but the need may vary. And so that if you're going to a private school, it may cost you just about the same as going to your public institution in your state. So that is why that is there, to kind of show you how to compare those two and how your EFC stays the same and how your need can vary from institution to institution. Now, sometimes if you get an award back in your award, if you're like at two similar schools, the price is about the same, but the award or the aid is coming back different, then you reach out to those institutions and talk to them, because sometimes you can make mistakes on applications, and we'll talk about that a little bit more later. Or sometimes one school may have information that another school does not. So just keep that in mind when you're comparing those particular financial aid packages as well. All right, Ginger, I think I'll turn it over to you on this one.
You got it. So the Fafsa is a term we use fast and loose, but you should know that it stands for by now, hopefully, the Free Application for Federal Student Aid. That is a free application. The first F stands for free, which means that if someone charges you money to complete that application, they are breaking the law. If you ask someone to help you and you want to give them a lovely gift, that's so nice of you, but you really can do it yourself. It's really not that complicated, particularly once you've completed your taxes. It will actually pull information from your taxes. And so it used to be in the old days, you just had to have them side by side, and then it would be line 28B and you'd enter line 28B, but now they do it for you magically. So you'll be able to take advantage of that. A lot of it does, of course, happen online. Studentaid.gov is a terrific resource, and one of the places where you can kind of do some finding out about need-based financial aid programs, loan programs, and find the application for the Fafsa. It is only available to submit starting on October 1st of a student's senior year. Please, please, please do not attempt to submit the Fafsa before October 1st of a student's senior year, but please do complete it as soon after that as you can. Every school has its own deadline for financial aid, and states have their own deadline for completing the Fafsa, and people can run out of money. So it is helpful to complete the application as soon in the process as you can, complete it effectively, right? So I mean, don't go starting it when you don't have the information you need, but the Fafsa is based on your prior year's taxes. So it's already happened. Then money has already been earned. The government already knows about it. So you're not waiting for anything to come through from that particular year. Though obviously circumstances change. That certainly has been a case during the pandemic, and those are things that will be taken into consideration. But you will you enter your personal information, and one of the ways that you start is you get a PIN number, and it kind of goes back and forth. So allow some time, relax, make a little pot of tea or whatever sort of calms your nerves as you go and complete the forms, but it really is doable. And there are lots of great resources out there, free resources that will help students complete the Fafsa if they don't have support at home to do it. Oh, do you want me to say more things? Okay, I'm going to keep going. So when you apply for the Fafsa, you'll get a parent and student ID number to confirm your identity. You'll do an electronic signature of the Fafsa, and you will need it, so hang on to it. Every year you apply for need-based financial aid because family circumstances change. That lottery ticket might have been a winner, in which case the call is not coming from the financial aid office, it's the development office, and they want to know which building you'd like them to name after you. But if you're, but family circumstances change, students also become more well, they can take on a little more debt, and as they get a little bit closer to graduation. So some of those ratios and things like that can change over year over year. So you will apply for need-based financial aid each year. For some families, for example, they were not in a position to qualify for financial aid, but then there's been a change in their circumstances. They took on responsibility for an elderly parent. Parent lost their job. There's more children in college at the exact same time. So there are different circumstances that need to be considered. And that's why you apply again every year. You'll want to gather the records you need along with that pot of tea, as I'm suggesting, including the student's driver's license and social security card, W-2 forms, and other records from any money that you've earned. You'll need your income tax returns. You'll need records of untaxed income. If you own a business or a farm as a family, there are some special forms for that as well as information about any investments that you have. Lots of parents ask about their retirement funds. Retirement funds are not considered during the need-based financial aid review process, but student assets are considered. So savings that you have that's particularly earmarked towards college, like a 529 plan and that sort of thing. And then, as I mentioned, I didn't tell you that it's called the DRT, but it's the data retrieval tool is the magical thing that enables the one side of the government to talk to the other so that they can pull your prior year, which would be 2019.
Yeah, so for the current year, it's 2019.
It's 2019, right?
Yeah.
It opened in the fall of 2021. Okay, and so it'll pull from there.
And so I just want to add a couple of things on here. And it says 2019. So the trick I've always said, the fall that you're entering -2. So it's about, if you're going to start college in fall of 2022, then you'll need 20 tax returns. If you start fall of 2023, then it's fall, you need 2021 tax returns. So we're always 2 years behind. And we feel like that kind of measures your financial strength. It gives us a better picture. In the olden days, we were always waiting to get a family's current tax return, which could kind of delay the information and also not be as accurate because a lot of families didn't know. And so it's been very helpful for us to go back to prior year. And the other statement, I just want to add on retirement funds for parents. So if your retirement funds are in a bona fide retirement plan, then it does not count. But I know sometimes families may put money in investments or other things, but we do count those. So just be careful of that. We've had a lot of families that say, well, this investment is my retirement. Well, since it's not in an IRA or 401k or 403b, then we have to count it. So just keep that in mind as you're going through the process and you're hearing, talking about your assets for the family. And so with Ginger, did you want to continue on this one? Okay.
So just a couple of tips, words from people who've done this more than once. Make sure that you use the correct name, date of birth, and social security number. It's really, really important to get it right from the beginning. And this is one of those times that you can just, for example, I go by Ginger, but my given name is Virginia. And when I was in high school, was not as accustomed to the fact that Virginia has credit and Ginger doesn't. So just remembering that you've got to use the student's full legal name, which can be complicated, can bring up some history for some families. So just know that that's coming. Make sure they know their date of birth, make sure that they know that it's month first, day, and then year. And then their social security number, which by the time this whole process is done, they'll have tattooed on their forehead, or it feels that way anyway. You round off figures to the nearest dollar, so you do not need to be specific down to the cents, so don't worry about that. Rounding is your friend. When it says you and yours in the Fafsa application, it's speaking directly to the student. So even if you as a parent are the one completing it or providing support for your student as they complete it, recognize that they don't mean you, they mean your kid. And really do read the instructions. I know we live in a too long didn't read kind of world now, but it's very, very straightforward. They want you to be able to apply for financial aid and receive the aid that you should be eligible for. So if you read the instructions, you really will see everything that you need to do. Okay, so what happens next when you fill out your FAFSA? You will get something called the SAR, your Student Aid Report. And that includes the EFC, the Expected Family Contribution that Chanel was talking about earlier, and that will be used to determine your eligibility for need-based aid. When you get your Student Aid Report, you need to review it for accuracy immediately. If there's anything that is amiss, you need to go back and fix it. And that's why you tried to complete this application as early as possible in the process. The schools that you have listed will receive your student aid report information electronically. You can put in up to 10 schools when you first complete the FAFSA. If you wind up applying to more schools than that, you can submit additional schools after the initial student aid report. And lots of students wonder, which schools should they list? What order should they list them in? I list schools in the order of the application deadline. So whichever schools you apply to early, you apply for financial aid from early. Schools that you're applying to under the regular decision process can get the information a little bit later from financial aid as well as from your application.
That's such great advice, Ginger.
Thanks.
And I just wanted to add, I know we talked about a little bit earlier about the Fsa Id, that you need that throughout the whole process. Now, sometimes families aren't able to create a Fsa Id and may have to do a hand signature on the application. If you have to do that, just know it takes a little bit longer for it to get processed by the Department of Education. So just keep that in mind if that is something that you will have to do when you're going through the process. It usually may take 4 to 6 weeks for it to get there as we're sending it through the mail, but just keep that in mind. That is an option if necessary. If a parent is unable to create an Fsa Id, then they are able to do a signature. So that is another option too, just to remember for the FAFSA application. And so now we'll talk a little bit more about the Css Profile Application. So the Css Profile, as I mentioned earlier, is typically specific to your private institutions a lot of times, and these are usually your schools who have institutional funds that they have to award to help meet families' demonstrated financial need. So you will hear this talk called often the Css Profile, as it is administered through College Board. And so this is to determine your eligibility, like I mentioned before, for non-government financial aid. So a lot of times schools have their own grants, their own loans, their own scholarships, but you must complete this application in order to be considered. And so this is available online. It's an online form that you will complete, and it's available at cssprofile.collegeboard.org. And there is a fee for this particular application. And so the initial application fee of $25, and then any additional reports are $16. But fee waivers are available, especially that first year. You're applying to multiple schools, so the costs may add up. So waivers are available in these 3 conditions here. If a student uses an SAT fee waiver, usually you have to use the same login information, and so that you will be able to receive that waiver for the Css Profile application. Then also, if the parental income reported is approximately $100,000 or less, you're eligible for a fee waiver. And then also, if the student is an orphan or ward of the court under the age of 24, also eligible for a fee waiver. So when you go through that process, it will tell you automatically as you're completing your application if you are eligible and meet those conditions listed there for a fee waiver. So that first year, you're applying to multiple schools, it would add up, but then in continuing years, you still have to reapply, but you're only submitting it to one institution at that time. So just keep that in mind. And I always say, I know there's a fee for it, but the return that you get back from completing the application and the monies that you could be eligible for from the institution is greater. So what's the difference? I know you're thinking, why are you asking me for the Css Profile and you have this FAFSA? What is the difference? So this is when we get into the methodology that's working with the Css Profile and the FAFSA. So the Css Profile allows institutions to have a little bit more flexibility. Think about with the FAFSA, it's one way that everything is reviewed and looked at in their methodology process. It does not change from institution to institution, but with the Css Profile, we can make some adjustments. And so it gives institutions some flexibility as well when they're looking at the need analysis for families. So it allows us to give a cost of living adjustment And so the CSS profile drills all the way down to the zip code for a family. So living in one part of, let's say, in Georgia, is more expensive than living in another area in Georgia. I always say here in Nashville, Tennessee, where I'm presenting from tonight, $100,000 here in this particular area is very different than where my dad currently lives in Columbia, Tennessee, about an hour south. And so it makes an adjustment based on that zip code. And so that reflects a higher cost of living and can give a different allowances for families as it's doing the review. In comparison to the FAFSA, it's just really looking at the state that you're from. So it's not going too much further than that. Also, the CSS profile allows us to gather non-custodial parent information. So the CSS profile collects data separately for non-custodial parents to determine a contribution. So this is optional for each school. Not every school will ask for the non-custodial parent application, but the CSS profile gives schools that flexibility to do so. So if parents are separated, divorced, as we mentioned in our need analysis, we believe that both parents should contribute towards that. And I know there's some special circumstances where that may not be possible. But we are able to gather that information and get that application, and it gives us that flexibility. Whereas with the FAFSA, you only provide information for the custodial parent. Also, there's differences in that methodology. The CSS profile determines your financial need differently than that FAFSA. The CSS profile, is looking at factors such as your family home, looking at that as part as going into the analysis. And with a CSS profile is really just more detailed than the FAFSA. I always say it's the FAFSA on steroids. So just a little bit more questions. And then we also have a minimum student contribution. So this is where we kind of talk about a student work expectation. The CSS profile requires is where the FAFSA does not. And so it kind of works with the philosophy and for each of the schools and allows us that flexibility to put that in there. A lot of times that we do find that the CSS profile is more generous than the FAFSA when we do our analysis and when we do comparisons, because there's some things that we can give additional allowances for that are not taken into consideration on that FAFSA application. So common problems that are found here, we'll talk about this. I know Ginger mentioned a little bit before when you're doing your date of birth, Social Security, especially on that FAFSA, that is so important because it can stop you right in your tracks. We cannot get your information at all. And if you submit it with the wrong Social Security number, typically you have to go back and redo the FAFSA again because it's tied to the wrong number. So that's why that is so important, especially name. Getting things matched in the system is very important. So just keep that in mind. Excuse me. So these are some of the common application errors that may happen. And then remembering all sources of income must be considered, including the non-taxable income. And then also remembering deadlines and then documentation. And so Ginger, I want to see if we can maybe take some questions now, if possible.
Absolutely. Glad to. Okay, so there are some that I can do and some that you're going to need to do. So let me try and do a few that I could do. Someone was asking about a PLUS loan and what is the amount that can be borrowed? How is that determined? And it is a painful truth that you can in fact borrow the total cost of education, which is entirely too much debt for anyone to take on. I say as someone who's completely unqualified to say that. I'm not a financial advisor, but I think that's fair to say. But that is the reality of it, which is to say that people will give you more. An outside loan source can give you more debt than probably is wise to take on. There was a question about applying for an appeal if you receive a financial aid award and going through the appeal process. I think we're going to talk about that in a little bit, but this family was asking specifically about if you apply early decision to one school and early action to another school, can you use the early action award to appeal the early decision award? I think that's a dicey one, because you promised the early decision school that if you were admitted, you would enroll. Now, yes, every loophole needs every contract needs a loophole, and the early decision binding agreement that you've made with the school can be broken if your financial aid award does not meet your family's need, but it should not be broken simply because it doesn't meet your family's want. And so I think it's a dangerous situation. I would contact the early decision school and ask to appeal the process, not based on the other school's award, but based on circumstances within your family's need that was not taken into consideration. I think that would be a better way to appeal. We have a few questions about having 2 or more students in college at the same time. Chanel, if you want to address that one, just because that has gotten a little bit different of late.
Well, yeah, and it's going to be different. And we're still learning it. So when the federal government makes changes to the process, we in the financial aid office are like trying to take these quick lessons to figure it out and how it's going to impact. So in the future, the number in college is not going to have as much as an impact on the Fafsa application for their review process. However, for the CSS profile and the way that it currently works now, that EFC is pretty much cut in half. So if you have 2 students and they're both going to college and you have a 20,000 EFC, and it's going to be split between the 2 of the students because we know that you're paying college for one and paying for college from other. So that's how it currently works with 2 in college. With the FAFSA, that is changing for the upcoming year. We are still learning on how that's going to really make a difference in that particular area. But the main thing is that the FAFSA is really determining your eligibility for the federal Pell Grant, which is most of the funds that are coming through that source of funding. And so that's not going to really have a big impact on like your loan eligibility. Students can still borrow up to a certain amount their first year, second year, third, and fourth year. But on that CSS profile, it is still taken into consideration. If you have 2 in college, we know that you have to take that EFC and spread it across those 2 students. So I hope that kind of helped answer that question, Ginger.
It did, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
We also do have questions about, as I mentioned, divorce and separated families and sort of all the complications in there. Is child support considered non-taxable or taxable income? And then sort of who counts as a parent and who has to fill out the forms and who doesn't have to fill out the forms. Is that something you want to address now, or we have 8 minutes? So we'll see how much more we can do.
Yeah, I think I can address that real quickly. With the family, is looking at whoever was in the household. So there's so many different circumstances and the way a family is made up that it's really case by case. But let's say the parents were never married and they're living together. Well, we're going to take both of the parents' information because they are within that household. But then if you have a divorced family, the process is typically that we look at the custodial parent. But some schools may start asking for the divorce decree to see what is in the agreement as far as the other spouse's contributions towards educational expenses. If you are divorced and get remarried, we have to count the new spouse's information as well. And so it's kind of tricky when you're going down the family dynamics, but you can talk to the financial aid offices because everyone is different. We always say, I can just give you an example for Vanderbilt. We do not request a non-custodial parent profile, but we do reserve the right to add a non-custodial parent contribution. So that we may collect information as far as what's coming from what's in the divorce decree to get a better understanding, because sometimes at that time it's decided that non-custodial parents should contribute $10,000 towards, well, we're going to include that in our analysis. So it's going to vary from school to school. And so that's a great question to ask. How do you review divorced families? But one thing is, if you are remarried, we are going to look at your new spouse's information as part of that. Whether or not they say they will contribute or not it's still going to be a part of the analysis. So I think I'm good now, Ginger, and I'm gonna go ahead and move on forward so we can get through on time. So now I'm gonna talk about financial aid checklist. And so this is just real briefly, as you go through each of the schools that you're applying to, you're gonna have a checklist to let you know what you need and what's missing. And so if we need a FAFSA CSS profile, it will be there. Usually it's combined with the admissions portal, but we'll have document updated when the documents are received, and it can vary by school, excuse me. But we also, a lot of schools will ask for parent and student tax returns. And so they will tell you how you can submit that information. A lot of schools are using electronic services to do that now. But then also you may be selected for what's called federal verification. And so that will be put on a checklist as well. So as you go on, this is just kind of a reminder, everyone gets really focused on the admissions application, what items are missing and what's there. But don't forget about financial aid. The timeline is different per school. Some people don't ask for, or some institutions do not ask for tax returns until you are admitted. Some institutions may ask for tax returns at the very beginning of the application process. So again, it's going to vary. So get familiar with how the school operates and what they need, but check those checklists so that you are aware of the timeline and what's still needed. And we also may ask for additional documentation. So like someone mentioned about having 2 in college, I wish we could just take the word for it, but sometimes we're going to ask for verification. Verify that your other student is in school. So there may be a college enrollment verification process to do that. Untaxed income, we may ask for verification about that. Remember, when you're completing both the FAFSA and CSS profile, when we see information that doesn't match, we have to figure out which information is correct. That is something that we're obligated to do. So if you put $10,000 on the FAFSA, but it's missing on the profile, we need to figure out where that money came from. And so we may ask for additional documentation to support that. So for assets as well as untaxed income verification. Family size, it's quite funny how many families don't get that right, whether it's 3 in the household or 2 in the household, but sometimes we need to verify that as well. But then also for merit scholarships, there may be a separate application process for that as well. So there may be a checklist for that also. So for financial aid packages, so this is where we provide a financial aid offer. This is where you get something from our office that details to you what your financial aid offer entails. And so the role of the financial aid office, as we've talked about, is to review your eligibility for financial aid. So it's usually an individual review at some institutions. And we're looking at, like we talked about a little bit earlier, separated divorced families. And so when we provide that financial aid offer, remember the methodology will vary by school. And that's kind of referring to that graphic I showed you earlier. But 100% demonstrated need with or without loans. Some schools meet a percentage of need, and some have another type of methodology that they use to make awards. So this is important to know when you're comparing financial aid offers that you receive from each of the institutions to which you have applied. And so the timing of notifications, as Ginger has mentioned, hurry up and wait. So October 1st comes and you get it done and you just kind of chill. Excuse me, until you hear back from the institutions. But on those award offers, you will see cost of attendance, types of amounts of aid offered, the subject to availability of funds, and then the terms and conditions to keep your award. Excuse me. So this is just a quick slide that shows you parent income and how that kind of varies. Excuse me, gives you the range of awards. And Ginger, can you jump in real quick on net price calculator?
No problem. So A great tip is to check out each school's net price calculator. By law, every institution is required to have one within 3 clicks of their homepage, but you can just ask your Google machine to find an NPC, as we call them, from each of the schools that you're applying to. It will, in a relatively quick way, give you a very, very rough estimate of what your actual cost of attendance will be. So every school has a sticker price, which is, tuition, room and board, books and fees, and personal expenses all added up. That's the sticker price. What you actually pay will vary based on your eligibility for need-based financial aid and the merit scholarships that you might be eligible for, as well as any state or federal funding that might apply. And of course, any outside scholarships that you might apply for. And you're welcome to join us at the next in our series called College and Money next Wednesday, where we'll be joined by Will Geiger from Scholarships 360 to talk about that. So you'll get an estimate from a net price calculator, and that will be incredibly helpful to let you know if early decision is a realistic choice, if which is to say that need-based financial aid will be enough to help support your application. So make sure that you don't just disappear that though. Take a screenshot, hang on to it, because if what you're ultimately asked to pay at the school doesn't match what you got from the net price calculator, that is an opportunity for you to have a conversation with the financial aid office. So hang on to those results. All right.
Thank you, Ginger.
You got it. We're at the top of the hour. So let's try and wrap things up as quickly as we can with a little bit about special circumstances and some good resources and suggestions to send everybody on their way with.
Yes, so special circumstances, we know that you provide that information to us, but things may change. We know that a job loss, there may be separation, divorce, one-time income, losses on the tax return. There are things that can happen. We know that life happens. So the biggest thing to take away from this, if you have special circumstances, is to submit a request to the office in writing. We call those letter of special circumstances, or just pick up the phone and call the office and talk to someone and say, hey, this is what's going on. What information do you need? But we are required to have the information in writing from you, and we'll need supporting documentation so that we can keep that on file. And so if the family's getting separated or divorced, we'll need that documentation as well. And so this is what we call a professional judgment for special circumstances. And the biggest thing to remember about this is that it must impact the numbers. So that's one thing. The numbers must be able to be changed in order for us to make any kind of adjustments to the student's financial aid offer. So these are some other sources. Department of Education, ed.gov, talks about the Fafsa. Studentaid.gov is a great resource for the Fafsa application. And then also finaid.org is a great tool as well. It has comprehensive financial aid information, scholarship search, and various calculators that you are able to use, but also use those net price calculators that Ginger just talked about briefly. And then I am now to questions, and I know we're at the end of the hour, but thank you, Ginger, for your help.
Of course, Chanel, thank you so much for hanging with us when I know you're not feeling great. And we've tried to cover as many questions as possible. There was one specific to Vanderbilt that I wanted to ask you, if you don't mind. I know that Vanderbilt will do a pre-read on financial aid. So can you talk a little bit about a pre-read for an early decision candidate?
So the pre-read, well, we'll just do the net price calculator, and then we'll go over it with the families. So if you do that net price calculator and then have questions about it, want to talk through it, keep those results, and then we'll use that information to discuss it for you to make sure you didn't make any incorrect amounts on there, because sometimes families will miss untaxed income that's reported. So we can do that for you. That's why the net price calculator is very good for early decisions. So if you're thinking of early decision at any schools, definitely encourage you to use the net price calculator. Because you will want to make sure that the financial aid is right. And typically merit scholarships do not come out until after early decision. And so sometimes you just want to make sure that you're taking that into consideration. So it's not a pre-read, but we will go over that net price calculator results with you.
Terrific. Thank you. I'm so glad that we were able to answer as many questions as we could in the last hour. I'm grateful, Chanel, for your super information and your generosity in sharing it. As I've mentioned, you will get a copy of tonight's recording and the slides. And this is the second in a three-part series we're hosting called College and Money. The last one was about controlling college costs. That was last Wednesday. And the next one coming up next Wednesday is about searching for outside scholarships. You're welcome to join us for all of them, and we will be happy to share recordings and information from all of those with you. One of the things we have found at Apple Ruth is that our students really do benefit from the effort that they put into test prep in a real and tangible way. On average, the students who work with us earn $3 in scholarship for every dollar they spent with us on test prep. So a great way to start the process and to see whether or not scholarships might be in your future through your SAT or ACT scores is to take a practice test that nobody but you needs to know about. And we're offering a special free practice test weekend coming up at the end of February. So if you come to appleruth.com and start here, we'll be glad to get you signed up for that and registered for all of our other events. Thank you all so much for joining us. We hope that we will see you at a future event, and thank you so much for your good questions and engagement tonight. We wish you all the best in the journey ahead of you. There's always a path to college. There's always a way to afford it. Keep asking at school, keep asking for good advice from resources and allies that you trust, and a way will open. Thanks, everybody, and good night.